What is up everybody, Sinestro here coming to you with a guide on the exciting new changes to Shadow Priest and the Legion pre-patch. We're going to be taking a look at all aspects of the new Shadow spec, as well as talking about what you can expect in regards to raid performance during the pre-patch and the expansion coming later next month. So without further delay, let's jump in and look at how the new Shadow Priest works. First up, let's take a general look at the mechanical changes to Shadow Priest in Legion, as they've been pretty extensive. In fact, along with Hunters, Rogues and Warlocks, we have probably been affected the most by the Legion updates. With the decision to revitalise the class fantasy of all specs and classes, we as Shadow Priests have been changed from a utility-heavy multi-dot class to an old god commuting single-target monster. Shadow Orbs have finally been dispatched with. Yes, that's right, your days of running outside the raid and killing mobs before every pull are finally over, friends. Those mobs outside HFC will finally be able to live longer than 15 seconds during raid times. Instead, we now have a brand spanking new resource by the name of Insanity. By casting our key kit spells, we fill our Insanity bar up to a maximum of 100. Once there, we have the ability to enter Void form. In this new form, we go completely insane. Our model starts growing tentacles, and we come closer to the realm of the old gods. We start speaking their language, and gain a stacking buff that grants us 1% haste per second, whilst we remain within the realm of Insanity. This new way of play is both refreshing and outstandingly fun. When we compare it to the 6.2 clarity of power playstyle that we have been suffering with for the last year, this new Insanity play is an absolute godsend. Now we have a general idea of how the new Shadow works, let's go over what's new and what's been pruned in the spellbook. Let's start by looking at the spells that have been removed. Leap of Faith, Flash Heal, Psychic Horror and Prayer of Mending have all gone, as well as Devouring Plague, Fear Ward and our AoE talent row, Cascade, Divine Star and Halo. However, we have gained some new spells. Void Eruption and Void Bolt have been added, as well as a new heal, Shadow Mend. We now also have access to Purify Disease, and when we get our hands on our artifacts at Legion launch, we will gain Void Torrent. There have also been some heavy changes to our remaining spells. Our 2 dots have had duration changes. Shadow Word Pain now only lasts 14 seconds, whereas Vampiric Touch lasts longer at 18 seconds. Power Word Shield no longer gives the weakened soul debuff, so it's now spammable on cooldown, and Mind Control has become a baseline spell. Vampiric Embrace, however, has been completely ruined. Instead of a raid-wide heal, it is now a random single target heal. The last real change we will see is Dispersion has been slightly nerfed, and now only reduces damage by 60%. So when we look at these changes, we can see some overarching themes. The spells that have been pruned and nerfed are the majority of our utility abilities, whereas the things that have been added and modified enhance our ability to deal damage. It's clear that Blizzard wanted the new Shadow to feel powerful and impactful, and they've definitely achieved their goal. Next up, let's look at talents and see what's new there. Our talent tree has had a major reshuffle, as well as being sprinkled with some new choices. There have also been some changes to the way talents work mechanically. Whilst in a rest area, you are able to change your talents freely. However, whilst out and about, you are no longer able to change without the new consumable, Tome of the Clearmind. Once used, this item gives you a buff for 1 minute that allows you to change as many talents as required. Whereas previously tomes were purchased from a vendor, Tomes of the Clearmind are made by players with the inscription profession. This means you will either have to make them yourself or purchase them through the auction house. At the moment, this means they're fairly pricey. Hopefully this price will drop, but at the moment this is a pretty extreme inconvenience. It makes tuning your character for specific fights more of a chore than it should be, and it's one of the changes in Legion that I am least happy with. That aside, however, let's talk about the new Shadow talent tree. At level 15 we have 1 familiar pick and 2 new choices. First up is Twist of Fate. This execute buff is well known to Shadow Priests and is a solid choice for most situations. Next up is Fortress of the Mind, a passive talent that buffs the damage and insanity generation of Mind Flay and Mind Blast. Finally, we have Shadow Word Void, a new single target spell that deals a truckload of damage and generates 25 insanity. At the present time, Twist of Fate is the default pick, as in HFC we're going to be bursting through fights pretty quickly. A strong execute is a huge bonus for us, so go ahead and lock that one in now. At 30 we have Mania, a talent that gives you passive movement speed for every stack of insanity you have. Next is Body and Soul, which again is a familiar sight. This talent still increases your movement speed when you have Powered Shield active. Finally there is Masochism, which alters the mechanics of our new heal Shadow Mend. By default, when you cast Shadow Mend on a target whilst in combat, it leaves a dot that deals half the damage healed to the target. Masochism turns this dot into a heal over time. With the removal of Weak and Soul, Body and Soul is the default pick at level 30, as you'll be able to spam the spell almost constantly if you need to dash across the battlefield. At 45 we start with Mind Bomb, a spell that applies a debuff to your target that after 2 seconds explodes, stunning all enemies within 8 yards for a further 2 seconds. Next is Psychic Voice, which reduces the cooldown of Psychic Scream by 30 seconds. Finally we have Dominant Mind, which alters your mind control ability significantly. Instead of controlling the mind control target yourself, it becomes a combat pet that acts the same way as your Mindbender or Shadow Fiend. Realistically, within a raid environment, none of these abilities are super useful. I would pick Dominant Mind just because it's the most fun pick, and gives you the ability to remove tougher trash mobs from a pack for a few seconds. At 60 we have a whole new row. We start off with Void Lord. This talent allows the lingering insanity buff that we are granted when exiting Void form to carry over to the next Void form for 8 seconds. Next we have Reaper of Souls. This extends our execute rage to 35%. Finally we have Void Ray. This gives us a buff every time that either Mind Flay or Mind Seer deal damage. This buff stacks up to 5 times and increases the damage of these 2 spells by 10% for each stack. There are 2 choices here at the moment. Reaper of Souls is great for any multi-target fight where you get Shadow Word deaths off regularly. Void Ray is the single target pick, as it, combined with the class trinket from HFC, is a really strong in a patchwork style situation. At 75 we start with San Lan. This buffs the damage and healing of Vampiric Touch by 20%. Next up is Auspicious Spirits. This increases the damage of shadowy apparitions by 100%, and each one now generates 4 insanity on hit. Finally we have Shadowy Insight. This gives Shadow Word Pain crits 10% chance to reset the cooldown of Mind Blast and makes the next cast instant. At the moment, the amount of crit we are able to keep in HFC gear, Auspicious Spirits is the default pick. However, I feel that Shadowy Insight will get some playtime in Legion, as when you get to high insanity stacks, your Shadow Word Pain hits like a machine gun. This gives the refresh rate on this buff way more chances to proc. At 90 we start with Power Infusion. This is the same as before, a 25% personal haste buff. We then have a new AoE spell, Shadow Crash. Shadow Crash throws a slow moving projectile at an aimed location that deals a good chunk of damage as well as generating 15 insanity. Finally we see the return of Mindbender, which deals a good chunk of damage as well as generating 4 insanity per attack. Mindbender is the only real choice here. It ties in so well with the rotation, and at the moment within HFC 4 set, you have access to it every 20 seconds, as well as the premonition buff when it expires. Finally at level 100 we have 2 new choices and 1 useless one. We start with Legacy of the Void. This allows you to enter Void form at 70 insanity instead of 100. Next we have the useless choice, Mind Spike. It now replaces Mind Flay and leaves a stacking debuff on the target that is detonated with Mind Blast, dealing a chunk of damage. Last but certainly not least, we have Surrender to Madness. This is probably the best talent we have ever had as Shadow Priests. Once activated, Surrender to Madness increases the generation of insanity by 200%. This makes it very easy to get into Void form and stay there for a significant amount of time. However, once you exit Void form, you die horribly. You receive a debuff that prevents you from being combat res for 2 minutes, and then the spell has a 10-minute cooldown. Both Legacy of the Void and Surrender to Madness are solid choices in this tier. However, Surrender to Madness requires a much deeper understanding of how the new Shadow Priest works. At the moment, whilst you're getting used to the changes and how encounters work, run with Legacy of the Void, and once you are more comfortable, switch to Surrender to Madness. We'll talk more about how a Surrender to Madness fits later on. Before we start talking about gear and rotations, we need to talk in a bit more depth about the mechanics of Void form. This becomes important when we are looking at selecting our final talent, Surrender to Madness. There are certain situations in which it will work, and ones in which it would be a significant DPS loss. In order to know when to make this decision, a few things must be understood. When we enter Void form, we gain a stacking buff, Insanity. This grants us 1% haste per second, and our insanity bar starts to drain at a rate of 10 per second. This drain amount starts to ramp up the longer we remain in Void form. This means that there is a hard cap on the amount of time you can remain within Void form. By the time you reach 180 seconds inside, you will be draining 100 insanity per second, and Void Form will become unsustainable. The only way to use the full potential of Void Form is to use Surrender to Madness, as it grants you 200% insanity generation. Insanity caps at 100 stacks, so you have the potential to spend 2+ minutes fighting with 100% extra haste. That's a lot of damage. Both of your dots will be machine gun spamming targets, and all your other spells will be at a reduced global cooldown rate. However, because Surrender to Madness kills you once you exit Void Form, you need to be careful when you use it. You need to understand encounters very well and know that you are going to be able to consistently cast spells. You do gain the advantage of being able to cast on the move, but if you have a period of more than 5 or so seconds without casting at high stacks, you will drop out and die. Whilst in Surrender to Madness, your reaction speeds need to be higher than normal. You need to be actively searching for Shadow Word death targets, and you need to be acutely aware of your rotation in order to maximize your insanity generation. Let's have a look at stat priority and gearing. There are two main build paths you can go for. One for playing Legacy of the Void, and one for Surrender to Madness. Let's start with Legacy of the Void. If you are on a single target patchwork style fight, your stat priority is as follows: Intellect, Haste, Crit, Versatility, Mastery. If you're on multi-target fights, your weighting changes slightly to Intellect, Haste equal to Crit, Mastery, Versatility. Once you feel comfortable enough to move over to Surrender to Madness, you should be looking for this in your gear instead: Haste, Intellect, Crit, Mastery, Versatility. As you can tell, Haste is our most valuable stat right now, and the more you are able to stack, the better you will do. In pre-patch, mythic fights are extremely quick. The new Shadow requires ramp up time, so the more stacks of insanity you have, the more damage you do. Therefore, logically, the more haste you can start a fight with, the less ramp up time you need. When we start to look at gear, knowing this information about stat weightings, we can draw some pretty obvious conclusions. First up, your 4 set from HFC is amazing. Make sure you keep that. And socketed gear is fantastic, as it allows you to put another 75 haste onto items. You should also be enchanting your gear for haste. Trinkets are slightly more complicated, as you'll have to be actively switching between fights. I will link a best in slot list below for you to have a look at, but I would also recommend taking a look at Warcraft logs. If you go to the rankings for HFC and sort by Shadow Priests, you'll be able to see who is using what trinkets and talent sets upon each encounter. This is a good way to optimize your playstyle. Finally, now we have a good idea of how the new Shadow works, we need to start looking at how you play it. When we look at rotations, we have 2 sets of cast priorities. We have our build phase and our insanity phase. Whilst building, we prioritize casts in this order: Mindbender, Mind Blast, Dots, Filler spells. Once at required insanity, we cast Void Eruption to enter Void Form, and at this point our cast priorities changes to this: Void Bolt, Mindbender, Shadow Word Death, Dots, Filler spells. When at high insanity stacks whilst using Surrender to Madness, your global cooldown will be reduced enough to where you can cast Void Bolt far more frequently. At this point, make sure you are casting it as often as you can. So let's see what this looks like in practice. In this section of the guide, we'll run through the rotation at a slightly slower pace. Now, I'm not going to be running with Surrender to Madness here, instead I'll run with Legacy of the Void. This way, while I'm slowing down, I won't just kill myself dramatically. Before I've pulled, I've done the basic things of applying my rune, my intellect flask, and my buttered sturgeon, which is 125 haste food. So when we looked at the rotation, we looked at the priorities whilst building, and the priorities whilst inside Void Form. So before we hit this target, we'd obviously do the first thing, which would be to pre-pot. Then we'd pre-cast Vampiric Touch, so that while the pull time is active, and then we'd cast Mindbender. Once then, we'd then cast Mind Blast and apply Shadow Word Pain. Then we'd fill with Mind Flay until Mind Blast became off cooldown. Once then, we'd go back to filling with Mind Flay, and now you can see that Void Eruption is ready to cast. At this point, we'd cast Void Eruption, and then Mind Blast, and then we'd cast Void Bolt straight away. Now, my dots, Void Bolt will refresh your dots, however, obviously, if I don't let them drop off, because I'm talking while I'm doing this. So make sure that you should be able to squeeze out a refresh rate on your dots at this point. Whilst in Void Form, remember that you should be prioritizing casting Mindbender, and you should be then prioritizing casting Mind Blast. Your dots will be refreshed by your Void Bolt, so make sure that you're just keeping them active. It's okay to refresh your dots whilst in combat, but it's not ideal. You shouldn't really have to unless you're sort of struggling with multiple targets. With Legacy of the Void, I'm able to enter Void form at 70 Insanity. However, realistically, it's probably not the best. If you entered at around 80 Insanity, you'd probably find yourself doing a little bit more damage. Now, I can't accredit this math to myself. That's been done by Melgane on How to Priest. So that's kind of like the basics of the rotation. We'll do it here at a little bit higher speed just so you can kind of get an idea. I will try and talk, but please just bear with me because it's kind of difficult to commentate and do this rotation at the same time. So, we'll start off by pre-potting the target, then we'll pre-cast Vampiric Touch. We'll then cast Mind Blender and Mind Blast, and then Mind Flay to fill. We'll then cast Shadow Word Pain, and then carry on filling with Mind Flay. I should have cast Shadow Word Pain before I Mind Flayed. Now we'll cast Void Eruption, and then Mind Blast. And then we'll fill with Mind Flay, and then cut Mind Flay to cast Void Bolt. We'll go back to filling here, then Void Bolt's off cooldown, then Mind Blast is off cooldown, then Void Bolt will be off cooldown again, and then Mind Bender will be active again. Then we'll come back to Void Bolt and Mind Blast, and then we'll go back into a Void Bolt again and cast Mind Flay. We'll then cast Void Bolt again, and then you can see we dropped out there, but we got 18 stacks. Now if you're hitting it between sort of 20 and 22, that's good. I could do 20 and 22 if I wasn't trying to talk, but that's kind of like your goal. So if you can start hitting between sort of like 20 and 22 stacks of Insanity without any raid buffs or big cooldowns, you're on the right mark. Next thing we'll do is we'll go back and talk a little bit about some tips and tricks, and then we'll look at a boss encounter. There are a few tricks we can use to extend our time within Insanity. Unfortunately, only one of them is available to us in pre-patch. Both tricks revolve around the use of Mindbender. As discussed previously, Mindbender gives us 4 Insanity per auto attack. This works really well when used with either Void Torrent, our artifact spell, or Dispersion. Both of these spells pause the drain of Insanity whilst active. However, Mindbender auto attacks have the ability to top up our Insanity bar whilst we're casting Void Torrent or Dispersion. This means that Dispersion is now actually a DPS cooldown. Now preferably you would always choose to use Void Torrent to do this, as it also deals a great damage. But during the pre-patch where we don't have this available, if you start to struggle to keep yourself in Void form, remember to cast Mindbender, then Dispersion to top your bar up to almost full. Now we have the basic gist of how the rotation works, let's take a look at it in an actual fight. I'll talk over an encounter and talk about my decision making, as well as go through the fight. Okay, so here we're going to be looking at Zul'Arak. So I'm running Surrender to Madness here, and I know that we're going to kill it within 180 seconds. So the first thing I do on pull is cast Pre-Plot, my Troll Racial, and pop Surrender to Madness. This gives me the 200% generation from the very start, which lets me get into Void form very quickly. As you can see, I'm hitting here. Once in, I'm using the priorities as well to make sure I'm Void Bolting and Mind Blasting and Mind Bendering before I do anything else. And as two new targets appearing, I'm making sure I dot them up. So as you can see, it's going down really quickly. The new mythic fights within the pre-patch are quite quick, so you need to make sure that you're optimizing the use of your time. So as you can see here, the first Vanguard is about to die, so I'm making sure I'm getting Shadow Word Death off that to proc Twist of Fate, and using Reaper of Souls to get those in earlier. Dots are being kept up on every target now, as you can see on the right hand side, although I did let Shadow Word Pain slip off Zol, which wasn't very good. Now I did okay on this fight, I got rank 21, which is quite nice for me because I did beat Hesp, which made me feel quite good inside. But I'm doing okay on DPS. Now you can see on recount on the side, I'm slowly starting to creep into the top 5 now. Now this is where we see the ramp up time that it takes as a Shadow Priest. So I'm hitting around 50 stacks, which gives me 120% haste. You can see that on just below my chat window. So you can see that my haste is building up quite quickly, and the fight is almost over at this point. Omnis is almost dead, he's almost within execute range. In fact, he is within execute range, and I'm making sure that I'm getting my Twist of Fate procs to keep my damage as high as possible. Now, I do admit I wasn't my best at positioning throughout all of this expansion. I've been in the Soak group because I had invisibility as a Shadow Priest, which we don't have anymore, so this is my first time dealing with the fire patches. But I'm doing pretty good. In fact, now I'm up to first on damage, now 170 plus 70k DPS. Now the thing here is I could have done a little bit better because the fight didn't end within my second potion range. However, if it does that, I knew I would have ranked a little bit higher. But as you can see, the boss is nearly dead. I'm coming up to 97, oh yeah, 98. I'm about to hit 100 stacks, probably just as the boss dies. So there we go, 100 stacks. Now I wasn't playing as optimally as I could, but there's 100 stacks. I'm there for a good few seconds actually. That's pretty good. I'm quite happy with that actually. Could do better though, which makes me feel quite nice. But there you go, that's Zul'Arak. That's actually an encounter of the rotation. Well, there we go. This has been a look at the updated Shadow Priest. I hope you've enjoyed this guide and found it useful. All the information used within this guide was either collected by myself whilst playing beta, or through the fantastic guide written by Melgane on how to priest. How to Priest is a fantastic community of priests of all specs. If you want to find out more about priest playstyles, I highly recommend you head over to the website linked in the description and join in the fun. If you liked this guide, please subscribe and hit the like button, and feel free to ask any questions in the comment section below. I'm also going to be streaming pretty regularly in pre-patch and Legion, so if you want to come hang out, feel free to follow me on Twitch. Thank you very much for watching this video, I hope you have a great day, and I'll catch you next time.